Have you ever heard the sound of a dream breaking? It's not a scream. It's a sudden, deafening silence where music used to be. The story you're about to hear begins with a silence just like that. It's a story about a boy named Leo, his cello, in the city of Viridia, which held its breath on the day his music died. But it's also the story of his mother, a woman whose love was a quiet force and whose anger was an invisible fire, powerful enough to bring an entire system to its knees. And trust me when I say this, the shattered cello on the pavement is just the tip of the iceberg. Because what lies beneath the surface isn't just a story of injustice, it's a conspiracy so deep it threatens to swallow the city whole. And we are going all the way to the bottom. Everything started not with a gunshot, but with the sound of splintering wood on the cold, unforgiving pavement of Viridia. It was a Tuesday morning in late November, the kind of morning where the city exhaled a gray, tired breath that hung in the air. The sky was the color of old stone, and the wind had a sharp bite to it, weaving through the alleyways and rattling the street signs. But for 12-year-old Leo Vance, none of that mattered. He stood on a quiet street corner, a small island of warmth in a sea of concrete and indifference. In his hands, he held his entire world. It was a cello, not a new, gleaming instrument from a fancy shop, but an old one. It was a deep, rich brown, scarred with the love and labor of 100 late nights. It had belonged to his grandfather, and you could feel it. You could feel the history in the smooth, worn wood beneath his fingers. It was his voice when he had no words. It was his friend when he felt alone. And on this morning, it was singing. The music that flowed from it wasn't a piece by Bach or Beethoven. It was Leo's. A melody that was both fragile and fiercely hopeful, each note a quiet act of defiance against the city's gray hum. It spoke of his dreams, of the Etheria Conservatory audition that was just days away, of the look of pride in his mother's eyes. The sound was deep, soulful, alive. It wrapped around the cold iron of a lamppost and made it seem a little less lonely. It danced on the steam rising from a sewer grate and turned it into a ghost waltzing in the morning light. He closed his eyes, his small body swaying with the music, lost in the world he was creating. A world where everything made sense. A world where a boy and his cello could speak a language more beautiful than words. That was the world that Officer Corbin chose to shatter. His police cruiser didn't glide to a stop. It lurched, its tires crunching over broken glass near the curb, with a sound that grated against the melody. The music faltered for a second. Leo's eyes fluttered open. Corbin stepped out of the car. He was a big man, built not with the lean muscle of an athlete, but with the heavy bulk of old anger. He moved like the world owed him something and was late on its payments. He didn't look at Leo as a child. He looked at him as an annoyance, a problem to be solved. His partner, Officer Miller, got out of the passenger side, but he stayed close to the car, his movements hesitant. He looked tired, not just tired from a long shift, but tired deep in his bones. Corbin's mouth twisted into a sneer. He didn't walk towards Leo. He stalked. "What do you think you're doing, kid?" His voice was gravel. It was the sound of a boot grinding out a cigarette. Leo's bow froze over the strings. The beautiful, resonant sound died, leaving a faint, humming echo in the air. I'm just practicing, sir." Corbin let out a short, ugly laugh. "Practicing? This is a sidewalk, not a concert hall. People are trying to live their lives here. They don't need to hear your racket." Racket. The word hit Leo like a physical blow. He looked down at his cello, at the beautiful curved wood that felt like an extension of his own body. He had never thought of its voice as a racket. "I'm sorry, sir," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible. "My audition is soon. I don't have anywhere else to—" "I don't care about your audition," Corbin cut him off, stepping closer. The air around him felt cold. "A kid like you should be learning a trade, not scraping away on this piece of junk." He gestured at the cello with a flick of his wrist, his contempt so thick you could almost taste it. This was it, the first true moment of impact, the collision of a pure, innocent dream with a bitter, baseless prejudice. You could feel the world tilting on its axis right there on that street corner. Leo wasn't just a boy with a cello anymore. He was a symbol. And Corbin was the embodiment of a hatred that seeks to silence anything it doesn't understand. Leo clutched the neck of his cello tighter. His knuckles went white. "It's not junk," he said, a tiny spark of defiance in his voice. "It was my grandfather's." That was a mistake. Seeing that spark, that flicker of pride in Leo's eyes seemed to ignite something terrible in Corbin. The sneer on his face hardened into something more sinister. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed the fear that was now creeping into the boy's eyes, extinguishing the light. "Oh, it was Grandpa's," he mocked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Then Grandpa should have taught you your place." And then he moved. It happened so fast, yet it felt like it unfolded in agonizing slow motion. He reached out, his thick fingers wrapping around the neck of the cello. Leo gasped, trying to pull it back. "No, please!" But it was like a sapling trying to resist an avalanche. Corbin ripped the cello from Leo's grasp. For a single, horrifying second, he held it up in the morning light. It looked so beautiful, so vulnerable, a work of art suspended in the hands of a brute. And then he brought it down. He swung it like an axe, smashing it against the concrete curb. The sound, it was a sound that will haunt Leo for the rest of his life. It was a sickening, splintering groan of wood, a final, discordant twang of snapping strings. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart, the sound of 100 years of history and a million future notes dying all at once. The cello exploded into a starburst of shattered wood and tangled wires. A jagged piece flew through the air, grazing Leo's forearm, leaving a thin, bright red line against his skin. He didn't even seem to notice. He just stared at the wreckage, at the unrecognizable mess that was once his whole world. He crumpled to his knees, a silent sob shaking his small frame. He didn't make a sound. The shock was too deep for tears. His hands, trembling uncontrollably, reached out, not to attack, not to defend himself, but to gently, tenderly touch the pieces. He picked up a splinter of dark polished wood, his fingers tracing the edge as if trying to understand how something so beautiful could be so broken. Officer Miller just stood there by the car. He flinched when the cello hit the ground. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He just watched. A statue of cowardice. That was the image. A boy kneeling in the ruins of his dream, his blood a tiny glistening dot on a piece of shattered history. A monster standing over him, breathing heavily with satisfaction. And a good man who did nothing. It wasn't just a cello that broke that day. It was a promise. The unspoken promise that the world makes to a child, that if you are good, if you work hard, if you create something beautiful, you will be safe. That promise was a lie, and its pieces were scattered all over the pavement of Viridia. But even in the deepest silence, when all the music has died, a new song can be born, a song of fire and of reckoning. The silence that followed Corbin's act of violence was more dangerous than the noise, because it hid a secret that was about to change everything. Across the street, a woman stood motionless. She had watched the entire thing unfold. She saw the sneer. She heard the words. She felt the sickening crack of the cello in her own bones. But she didn't scream. She didn't run. She stood as still as a statue in a storm, a pillar of impossible calm. And in that stillness, a fire was being forged. Her name was Serafina Vance, and she was Leo's mother. As Corbin kicked a piece of the shattered cello, a triumphant, ugly look on his face, she finally began to move. She didn't rush. She crossed the street with a slow, deliberate grace. Each step was measured, silent, and heavy with unspoken history. It wasn't the walk of a frantic mother. It was the walk of a queen crossing a chessboard, her eyes fixed on a pawn that had just made a fatal mistake. Corbin saw her approaching. He straightened up, puffing out his chest, ready to dismiss another emotional civilian. "Ma'am, you need to stay back," he began, his voice laced with condescending authority. "This is an official—" He stopped. She was closer now. He could see her eyes, and in them, he didn't see the fear or hysteria he expected. He saw something else, something cold, ancient, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the look of recognition. "Officer Corbin," she said. Her voice was quiet, not a whisper, but a low, resonant tone that cut through the morning air like a blade of ice. It's been a long time. The blood drained from Corbin's face, the arrogant posture, the cruel smirk. It all dissolved in an instant, melting away to reveal the weak, frightened man beneath. His mouth opened, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. He knew her. He remembered her. But he couldn't place it, not here, not now. It didn't make sense. And that's when you dive just below the surface of the water. This woman, this elegantly dressed mother whose son's heart lay in pieces on the pavement, was not just a lawyer. That was her old life. Her current title was one that Corbin only heard in hushed, fearful whispers back at the precinct. She was Director Serafina Vance, the head of the Federal Bureau of Special Investigations, the FBSI. The moment that realization hit Corbin, it was like a physical blow. He actually staggered back a step, his hand instinctively going toward his belt before freezing there. The world had just tilted off its axis. The predator had just realized he was standing in the den of an apex lion. He had not just assaulted a child, he had just declared war on one of the most powerful people in the country. And he had done it over a broken cello. But the iceberg goes deeper still, because this wasn't their first meeting. As Serafina looked at the man who had just brutalized her son, her mind went back. 10 years. A damp, dimly lit interrogation room. She wasn't the director then. She was a young, sharp, and maybe slightly too idealistic federal prosecutor. And Corbin was on the other side of the table, his career hanging by a thread, caught in a nasty kickback scheme. He had wept. He had begged. He had sworn he was a good man who made a stupid mistake. He swore he would spend the rest of his life making it right if she would just give him one more chance. And she had believed him. She had seen a flawed man who could be redeemed. She made a call, pulled some strings, and recommended probation instead of prosecution. She had saved him. She had handed him back his life, his career, his future. Mercy. What an expensive, foolish word. That single act of grace, that belief in a second chance, had grown like a poison seed over 10 years, culminating in this moment. The mercy she had shown him then had become the weapon he used to harm her son now. The irony was so bitter, so profound, it felt like acid in her throat. Her anger wasn't just at him. It was a cold, sharp fury at her own past self, for ever believing that a man like this could change. Her gaze then shifted from Corbin's pale, sweating face. It slid past him and landed on the other officer, on Miller. And this is where you truly begin to understand the rot. Corbin was the disease, loud, violent, and obvious. But Miller was the symptom. He was the silent complicity that allowed the disease to spread. He stood there frozen, unable to meet her eyes, looking at the ground, at his shoes, at anything but the truth of what he had just allowed to happen. Serafina didn't need to say a word to him. Her stare was an indictment. In his averted eyes and trembling hands, she saw the anatomy of every great crime in history. It's rarely just the hand that holds the weapon. It's the thousands of hands that hang limp at the sides, refusing to intervene. It's the voices that stay silent, the good men who do nothing. Miller was the reason men like Corbin thrived. He was the quiet, cowardly mortar that held the bricks of a corrupt system together. This wasn't just a story about a bad cop anymore. It was a story about a broken promise, a wasted second chance, and a system that protects its own, fed by the silence of the fearful. Because every act, every choice, every moment of silence, it all leaves a fingerprint, and Serafina Vance knew exactly how to read them. When a mother is pushed to the edge, she doesn't just fight back against a person, she becomes the war against the entire system that created him. The preliminary hearing wasn't a legal battle. It was a psychological dissection, held in a sterile room that smelled of old paper and quiet desperation. The air was thin and hard to breathe. All eyes were on one man, Officer Miller. He sat on the witness stand, drowning in a suit that suddenly seemed 2 sizes too big for him. He looked shrunken, diminished. Sweat beaded on his upper lip and traced shimmering paths down his temples. He wasn't the monster. He wasn't Corbin, who sat at the defendant's table with a look of bored, simmering rage. No, Miller was something far more common, and perhaps far more dangerous. He was a normal man who had made 1,000 tiny compromises with his soul, and now the bill had come due. The mini hook, the thing that drew you in, wasn't a lawyer's sharp question. It was the sight of Miller's hands. They trembled on the polished wood of the witness stand, his fingers drumming a frantic, silent rhythm. He was a man coming apart at the seams. Serafina sat at the prosecution's table, though she wasn't the one asking the questions. She didn't need to be. Her presence in the room was a force of gravity, pulling everything toward her. She watched Miller not with anger, but with a cold, clinical curiosity. She was watching the anatomy of cowardice. "Officer Miller," the prosecutor began, "can you tell us what happened on the morning of November 11th? Miller's confession didn't come out in a clean rush of truth. It stumbled out, wrapped in pathetic, flimsy excuses. He, Corbin, he has a temper," Miller stammered, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. "He was having a bad day. I told him to let it go." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I have a family, a mortgage. You do things. You go along because you don't want to make waves. You just want to finish your shift and go home." And there it was, the first emotional nerve. It wasn't an excuse that made you hate him. It was an excuse that made you deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Because in that moment, he wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was every person who ever stayed silent in a meeting when they should have spoken up. Every person who looked the other way. You felt a flicker of pity for his weakness, and that pity felt disgusting because you knew what his weakness had cost Leo. But the waters were about to get much deeper. The prosecutor pressed on. "This wasn't the first time you've gone along with Officer Corbin, was it?" Miller started to shake his head, a weak denial forming on his lips. But then he looked up, and for a second, his eyes met Serafina's. And in her cold, unwavering gaze, he saw that there was no escape. The lies were over. He broke. "No," he whispered, the word cracking. "No, it wasn't the first time." And then the floodgates opened. It wasn't just about covering for Corbin's temper anymore. Miller started talking about the fund, an unofficial slush fund, he explained, managed off the books. It was used for community relations. But what that really meant was paying for damages, making small lawsuits disappear, buying the silence of victims of overzealous policing. He talked about reports being misfiled, dash cam footage being corrupted during upload, over time slips that were really just hush money. This was the second sickening emotional impact, the slow, dawning horror that this wasn't about one bad cop, or even two. This was a system, a machine, designed with plausible deniability at every turn, built to protect itself. Each detail Miller gave was a small, dirty gear in that machine. The story was no longer about a boy and his cello. It was about the rot that had set in at the very foundations of the city's protectors. You could feel the air in the courtroom grow heavy, thick with the stench of old buried crimes. Miller was sobbing now, full, ugly sobs. "He saved my career once. I owed him. I didn't know what else to do." The judge looked weary. The defense attorney looked pale. The entire room was paralyzed. Then Serafina stood up. The movement was silent, fluid, but it commanded the attention of the entire room. She didn't look at the weeping man on the stand. She turned her head slowly and looked at the judge, then at the lawyers, then at every single person in a position of power in that room. "His cowardice is not unique," she said, her voice calm, but it filled the space completely. "He is simply the one who broke first." She took a step forward. "For years you have all known. You've known about the fund. You've known about the misfiled reports. You have sat in your comfortable chairs, behind your polished desks, and you have presided over a culture of silence." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like poison. "Your silence," she said, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. "That is also a confession." That was the final devastating blow of this chapter. It was a moment of pure, righteous fury that landed with the force of a physical impact. She wasn't just talking to them. She was talking through them, to the entire system they represented. She pointed a finger, not at Miller, but into the heart of the room itself. You didn't hold the boot that crushed my son's dream, Your Honor, but you polished it every morning. You didn't wield the hand that broke his instrument, but you signed the paychecks. You created the world where a man like Corbin felt invincible. Because you all stayed quiet. A single crime can be a tragedy, but a system meticulously designed to protect criminals, nurtured by the complicity of those in power, that is a declaration of war against the very people you swear to protect. Because the truth, once it is finally spoken aloud, can never ever be unsaid. But even when you believe you have finally hit the bottom, you learn that there's always a deeper, darker, more terrifying level waiting just below. When a man has nothing left to lose, he becomes the most dangerous person in the room. Serafina's words had not convicted Miller. They had cornered him. And a cornered animal doesn't reason. It bites. He looked up from the witness stand, his face a grotesque mask of tears, sweat, and terror. The pathetic weeping man was gone. In his place was something wild, his eyes darting around the room with a manic, unhinged energy. The system he had served, the system he had protected with his silence, was about to cast him aside. He was the fall guy, the disposable piece, and in that moment of absolute clarity, he decided he would not fall alone. "You want the truth?" he shrieked, his voice cracking, clawing its way up his throat. "You want to see how deep this really goes?" Before anyone could react, his trembling hand shot into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device, a personal data drive. His thumb hovered over a small icon on its screen. It was his insurance policy, his dead man's switch. "You think this is about Corbin?" He laughed, a high, hysterical sound that echoed in the stunned silence. "Corbin is nothing. He's a symptom. You want the disease? I'll give you the disease." And with a final guttural cry, he pressed the screen. This was the abyss. Instantly, the large courtroom monitors, which had been showing a static seal of the judiciary, flickered and changed. The room plunged into a chaotic opera of digital evidence. There were no lawyers presenting it, no context, no order. It was a raw, unfiltered data dump straight from the heart of the city's darkness. Shadowy surveillance photos of powerful men exchanging envelopes in dimly lit parking garages. Audio files with distorted voices, talking about containment and acceptable losses. Scanned documents, heavily redacted, but with signatures that were shockingly recognizable. Spreadsheets filled with encrypted code names and transfers to offshore accounts. Gasps ripped through the chamber. A lawyer in the front row shot to his feet, knocking over his chair. A woman in the gallery cried out, her hand flying to her mouth. The entire carefully constructed decorum of the courtroom didn't just break. It detonated. Reporters were screaming into their phones. People were shouting, pointing at the screens, their faces a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. It was the sound of a city's deepest secrets being violently exhumed. But in the center of that hurricane, there was a single point of calm. The moment the screens lit up, Serafina moved. It wasn't a panic. It was a reflex, as swift and sure as a hawk shielding its young. She pulled Leo from his chair and into her arms, turning him away from the screens, bearing his face into her chest. She clamped a firm, steady hand over the back of his head, her fingers splayed, shielding his eyes and ears from the ugliness. He sobbed into the fabric of her dress, his small body trembling. The chaos was a terrifying roar all around them. But in their small circle, there was only the sound of her breathing and the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart. She leaned down, her lips brushing against his ear, her voice a low, molten anchor in the storm. "Do not listen to their screaming, my love," she whispered, her voice fierce and certain. "Listen to my heart. That is the only rhythm that matters right now. Just listen to my heart." And in that moment, in the eye of the storm, you saw her true power. It wasn't the badge. It wasn't her title at the FBSI. It was this unbreakable sacred circle of a mother's love, a fortress that no amount of chaos could penetrate. The world could burn down around them, but here, in this embrace, they were safe. The screens continued their merciless broadcasts. The names that flashed across them were no longer just cops. They were pillars of the community, names that adorned law firms and charity balls, Judge Royce, Commissioner Thorne, Senator Callahan. The rot went all the way to the top. The iceberg wasn't just below the police department. It was the foundation of the entire city. Miller had collapsed on the witness stand, his manic energy gone, replaced by a hollow, shuddering emptiness. He had lit the fuse, and now he was being consumed by the explosion. Then from the center of the storm, a small voice cut through the noise. Leo turned his head slightly in his mother's embrace, his cheek still pressed against her chest. His voice was a fragile, trembling whisper, but in the chaos it felt as loud as a thunderclap. "Mama," he said, his breath hitching, can, can my music fix this?" The question hung in the air, so pure, so painfully innocent, that it silenced everything. It was a question that came from a place beyond anger, beyond revenge, beyond the complex ugliness of the adult world. It was the question of a child who still believed that beauty could heal a broken world. Serafina's arms tightened around him. She squeezed her eyes shut, and for the first time, a single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. It was a tear not of sadness, but of a fierce, heartbreaking pride. His spirit, after everything, was still intact. His first thought wasn't of the violence, but of the cure. The truth isn't a gentle rain that nurtures. It's a wildfire that burns away the dead wood, that clears the ground, that scorches the earth until nothing is left but the raw, honest soil. It is terrifying in its power. It is destructive in its purity. Because only on cleared ground, only after the fire has passed, can something new and beautiful have the space to truly grow. And in that quiet moment after the last scream has faded and the last secret has been exposed, we are all left with a choice. We must decide what kind of world we want to build from the ashes. When the last screen went dark and the last shouted headline faded into the noise of a city in shock, what was left? Not a victory parade, not a celebration, just the quiet, fragile dawn breaking over the rooftops of Viridia. The final scene of this story isn't in a courtroom full of chaos. It's here, on a balcony high above the sleeping streets. Serafina Vance stands there, watching the first hesitant rays of sun paint the gray skyline with strokes of pale gold, as if the sky itself was unsure if the world below deserved its light. Leo stands beside her. He's not crying anymore. In his arms, he cradles a new cello. It's not the same. It doesn't have his grandfather's history carved into its wood, but it's his, a new beginning. He plucks a single string, and the note that rings out is clear and strong and full of a quiet promise. And in that moment, you find the answer to the question that hung in the air of that broken courtroom. Can my music fix this? The truth is, no. Music cannot rewrite laws. It cannot erase corruption, and it cannot undo pain. But that was never the point. We don't fight the monsters of the world so that our songs can become weapons. We fight the monsters so that we can finally create a world where our songs can just be songs. A world where a boy can stand on a street corner and play his cello in peace. The fight wasn't for the victory. It was for the silence that comes after. The silence that allows for beauty to exist without fear. The story of Serafina and Leo feels epic, like a grand battle between gods and mortals. But in the end, it's our story, isn't it? Every single day we are presented with a choice. We see the small injustices, we hear the casual cruelties, we feel the pressure to stay silent, to not make waves, to just get home at the end of the day. We all have a little bit of Miller inside of us, whispering that it's safer to look away. But this story asks us a different question. It asks us if we can find a little bit of Serafina inside of us too. The part that sees a wrong and decides quietly and with unbending resolve, enough. It asks us if we can find the courage of Leo to pick up the broken pieces of our own dreams and dare to make music again. Because justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms with dramatic confessions. It happens in the small, brave choices we make every single day. It's in the decision to speak up, the decision to stand for someone who can't, the decision to protect the beautiful, fragile things in this world.